I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as Kyiv struggles through sub-zero temperatures, we report on Russia's latest mass aerial attack on the city that took place even as trilateral so-called peace talks were going on in Abu Dhabi. We look at the latest visit by Steve Witkoff to Moscow, he's still yet to visit Ukraine, and ask why Russia is now pushing the mysterious Alaska formula in a bid to gain territory it has not been able to seize by force. And later, Francis visits the British Army's Land Warfare Centre with Hamish to Bretton-Gordon, where the next generation of soldiers are learning the lessons of the war in Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 26th of January, 3 years and 338 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor for Audio, Francis Dearnley, and former Tank Unit Commander, Hamish to Bretton-Gordon. I started with a wash-up of the weekend's diplomatic activity. So the 2 days of trilateral peace talks between Ukraine, Russia and the United States held in the United Arab Emirates ended on Saturday night without a breakthrough. Now this followed a very busy day of diplomacy on Thursday. You'll remember back in Davos when President Zelensky met Donald Trump. And that was just as the US envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were heading off to a separate late-night talk with Putin in Moscow. Now, Steve Witkoff later described the trilateral talks on Saturday as very constructive. But that didn't stop Russia from firing hundreds of drones and missiles at Ukraine as the talks were going on. So 370 drones and 21 missiles of various types targeted Kyiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, Chernihiv regions overnight Friday, Saturday. Responding to that clear snub of the peace talks by Putin, the US administration said nothing. No comment whatsoever. They felt no need to offer an opinion that perhaps firing high explosive rounds at civilians might be seen by some as indicating a lack of seriousness towards the ongoing so-called peace negotiations. Now, for the record, Ukraine did shoot down the one Russian Kh-59 or 69 variant guided aviation missile. However, they shot down neither of the two Zircon anti-ship missiles. They hit 9 of the 12 Kh-22 or 32 cruise missiles, 5 of the 6 Iskander-M or S-300 ballistic missiles, and 357 of the 375 drones. All fired, as I said, whilst the so-called peace talks were ongoing. The effect of those munitions was, as you'd expect, thousands are still without power in Kyiv. The left bank of the city, the eastern side, in particular badly hit. The Dnipro River runs north-south basically through Kyiv, so it's split into east-west. So the eastern side is the worst affected. Images from Ukraine, or of Kyiv in particular, you'll find of military rubberized hangars with generators providing heat and light for citizens. Inside, there are images of long rows of trestle tables upon which people are eating hot meals. It will look very familiar to any military personnel having a look, except that the lights are working and the tents don't leak. Now, Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said yesterday there are still 1,330 residential buildings in Kyiv. That's about 15% of the city's housing stock that remain without heating after Russia's recent attacks on critical infrastructure. I note today's temperature is a high of -2 Celsius today in Kyiv, rising this week to an expected +1 on Wednesday. The problem with that is that the snow melts. Many people from my former military life, they'd prefer it to be a good few degrees colder than having the temperature hover around zero because you get the thaw freeze, all that kind of stuff. It's easier to brush really cold snow off your clothes, but if they get wet in those temperatures, it is a huge, huge pain. Anyway, Russian strikes continued overnight Saturday, Sunday. Russia launched 102 drones and 2 Iskander ballistic missiles. Most of the drones were shot down. I've not seen any information on the missiles. Now, for what it's worth, President Zelensky said the main thing that the talks in Abu Dhabi focused on were the potential parameters for ending the war. He said, "I value greatly that there is an awareness of the necessity of American monitoring and control over the process of ending the war and maintaining real security." Now, I saw those comments. I thought that was a bit optimistic, personally. I've not seen anything from the US to suggest that they agree there's any necessity for American monitoring and control or a desire to maintain real security. That might just be my interpretation, though. The trilateral talks are due to resume in Abu Dhabi this coming Sunday, February the 1st. Now, during that meeting between Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner and Vladimir Putin on Friday night in Moscow, Putin said there is no point in hoping for a settlement of the war without resolving the territorial question. Now, on this, according to Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov, Putin also said that any agreement must resolve the territorial issue, quote, according to the formula agreed upon in Anchorage. Now, that's the meeting with Trump in Alaska last August. Now, why is that important? Well, because it was ahead of that meeting that the Kremlin had first demanded Ukraine withdraw its forces from the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast that it hadn't been able to take in 4 years of full-scale war. So, Putin is now referring to a formula, quote, agreed in Anchorage, as if it's baked in stone, the only way ahead, as if Ukraine has already signed up to some sort of territorial concession plan and they're now backing out of the agreement. We should expect to keep hearing Russian officials talking about this so-called agreed formula to try and make it an accepted currency, the agreed starting point for any future discussions about territory, when in fact it's complete fabrication. Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov said Putin reiterated this position to US negotiators, framing it as a non-negotiable condition for progress towards a long-term deal. Now, Russia may have decided that getting hold of unoccupied parts of Ukraine was agreed upon, but we've never heard anything like that from Ukraine. This is just another way Russia trying to dominate the narrative. The trouble is that a lot of people, particularly on the US side, seem to be accepting it. Nothing was agreed in Alaska. I was there. You know, the press conference, such as it was brought forward and only went on for 8 minutes, although I spent most of that time arguing about where I was allowed to sit with the White House Correspondents Association. I digress. Anyway, a very well-placed contact sent me the following message regarding the Witkoff-Kushner talks in Moscow. 4 points. Number one, the negotiations were described as, quote, expectedly difficult but not hopeless. So this is from my contact who has contacts very close to these meetings. Expectedly difficult but not hopeless. Number two, Putin's not willing to make any real compromises on the territorial issue. Number three, Putin is prepared for an energy ceasefire, but only on the condition that Ukraine halts attacks on oil refineries, fuel storage facilities, electricity generation infrastructure, and district heating and energy systems, and ceases legal and enforcement actions against tankers of the Shadow Fleet. Any violation of these conditions would trigger a corresponding response from Moscow. So again, the Russian way, just in negotiations, demand everything, refuse to budge an inch. So that is effectively denying Ukraine any ability to fire in this area at all, as Russia is. And number four, Putin is demanding elections in Ukraine, arguing that, quote, without them, no agreements can be legally formalised as the president of Ukraine is not legitimate. So nothing particularly different from what we've heard recently, which is interesting given that if you see the outcome from Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, they put a much more positive light on it. Steve Witkoff, who has been to Russia now, I think, 7 times, not yet found the time to visit Ukraine. Anyway. Now, the Kremlin continued to try to dominate the news agenda over the weekend, although they were somewhat preoccupied with bending, jerking and kneeing. On Saturday, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that Donald Trump's knee-jerk foreign policy methods do not align with Russia's own, and that the Kremlin views those methods as designed to force others to bend over the knee. He said that those that do bend to Trump will continue to bend over, and that it's imperative that Russia does not bend to Trump. I mean, good luck bending over all those knees with all the jerking going on. But anyway, never mind. Right, into Russia. Belgorod Regional Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov, he said Ukrainian attacks overnight Friday, Saturday were, quote, the most massive strike on Belgorod city. But he only gave details of one utility outbuilding that had caught fire. He said HIMARS had been used in the strike, the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, the long-range rockets supplied by the US and others, but mainly the US. Gladkov said HIMARS had been used, although he offered no evidence of that, and I have seen that claim disputed online. He said there had been damage to energy infrastructure, but gave no other details other than that outbuilding that caught fire. He did, however, say that there are no casualties. So I don't really know what, if anything, happened in Belgorod on Friday night. Now, this morning, Russian Telegram media channels are saying Ukrainian drones reportedly struck an oil refinery in the town of Slovyansk-na-Kuban. That is in Russia's Krasnodar Krai region, about 100 k's east of the Kerch Bridge. The strike is supposed to have happened last night. Local residents posted imagery on social media that appeared to show a glowing night sky from the direction of the reported oil refinery. Russian officials said just that. Yep, our old friend, drone debris. The deadly drone debris fell on 2 enterprises, but they gave no details of what those enterprises may or may not have been. Okay, this morning, President Zelensky is in Vilnius in Lithuania. He's at a press conference a few hours ago. He said a document outlining US security guarantees for Ukraine is complete. Speaking to reporters, he said, "For us, security guarantees are first and foremost guarantees from the United States. The document is 100% ready, and we are waiting for our partners to confirm the date and place for its signing." He said that once signed, the document will then need to be submitted for ratification to both the US Congress and Ukraine's parliament. That's going to be a very interesting step if it gets that far. Now, elsewhere in his address, he said that Ukraine will be ready to join the European Union by 2027, saying Ukraine's membership of the bloc would serve as an economic security guarantee. Now, I'm not sure exactly what he means by that. What is an economic security guarantee? But anyway, we will hear more of that, I'm sure. Again, so room for manoeuvre there in interpretation. Now, he's in Lithuania to mark the anniversary of the January uprising of 1863-64, when Ukrainian, Polish, Lithuanian and Belarusian people rose up against the Russian Empire. He met the presidents of Lithuania and Poland, and for the first time, exiled Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. She's widely regarded as the winner of the Belarusian 2020 presidential election, a woman we've spoken to a couple of times on the pod. On the ground over the weekend, no real move at all. However, I note this morning, Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky said Russian forces are continuing attempts to expand their offensive around Pokrovsk, bringing up reserves and using infiltration tactics. I mean, there has hardly been any move for weeks as the brutal winter temperatures impact everything. There's virtually nothing in Pokrovsk. So General Syrsky had just visited troops in the area, so he was making those comments. But whilst the casualty rate is still high, there is virtually no move in the line. Now, what else happened over the weekend? Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, she arrived in Greenland. She was met by Greenland's Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen. No word yet from Denmark or Greenland on what that accommodation with the US might look like. Also, a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker called Progress, somewhat ironically, is reportedly drifting near Algeria for an unknown reason. It is operating under the flag of Russia, thought currently to be carrying just over 700,000 barrels of oil. Now, the not under command status means a vessel is unable to manoeuvre or give way to other ships because of exceptional circumstances, typically including steering or engine failure, power loss or unexpected damage. You'll remember on Thursday, the French Navy intercepted another tanker, the Grinch, which was carrying Russian oil and travelling along a similar route. No reports I've seen suggest military activity or blasts or limpet mines or anything like that. So we don't know if there's been any unexpected damage on the Progress, and last seen drifting east at about 1 knot, 1 nautical mile per hour. Okay, a couple more for me. Just before Christmas, we spoke about this. You may remember there was a story that suggested that Germany may donate the soon-to-be retired Westland Mark 88 Alpha Sea Lynx maritime strike helicopters to Ukraine. Well, that seems to have been confirmed. I've seen a letter sent from Jens Hannefeld, who's the German ambassador to the United States, a letter from Herr Hannefeld to members of Congress, which says 10 Sea Lynx Mark 88 Alpha will be delivered to Ukraine, plus training measures, modifications, and several years of technical and logistic support will be included. Now, because of US components in the aircraft, Germany had to seek approval from the United States under ITAR, that's the US International Traffic in Arms Regulations. That permission, which is not always given, but that permission was given to Germany on January the 2nd, meaning the transfer will happen in the near future. That's the German ambassador saying. Now then, happy Australia Day if you're in Australia, although Australia Day is today, Monday. So you're probably listening to this, if it's a podcast, you're listening on Tuesday. So, well, I hope you had a happy Australia Day. There we go. The Albanese government is providing a further 10 million Australian dollars, that's about nearly 7 million US dollars, to Ukraine's energy support fund. Worth noting, we do take these opportunities to dial in. Since the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Australia has provided more than 1.7 billion Australian dollars rather than US dollars, 1.7 billion in military, humanitarian, economic and energy assistance. And this latest announcement brings Australia's total contribution to Ukraine's energy support fund to $40 million, I think Australian dollars. And just finally, still on energy, Reuters are reporting this morning that European Union countries have today given their final approval to ban Russian gas imports by late 2027, making their vow to cut ties with their former top supplier legally binding. So Russian liquefied natural gas, LNG, is no longer going to enter the EU from January the 1st, 2027, and pipeline gas will be turned off from September the 30th. EU ministers approved the law at a meeting in Brussels earlier today, although Slovakia and Hungary voted against it and Bulgaria abstained. Hungary said it will file a lawsuit with the European Court of Justice. Now, Reuters says that Russia supplied more than 40% of the EU's gas before 2022, and that share dropped to around 13% in 2025, according to the latest available EU data. Finally, well done.
Thanks, Dom. And now to a special segment built around a key question. What lessons are European armies really learning from the war in Ukraine? To dig into that in a more in-depth fashion than we ever have before, the Ministry of Defence invited me behind the wire on a cold winter's day for a visit to the British Army's Land Warfare Centre on a base near Warminster. I was joined by former tank commander and chemical weapons expert Hamish de Bretton-Gordon for a tour around a place he knows well, where soldiers train for operations, new equipment is tested, doctrine is written and rewritten, and tactics are adapted in real time, drawing directly on the battlefield realities in Ukraine and in close partnership with NATO allies.
So, Francis, we've just come out of what used to be Director Infantry when young Dom and I were here many, many moons ago. And looking due east is what used to be the Armoured Tactics and Reconnaissance Division, where me as a young captain straight out of the Gulf War first met young Dom, who was a baby tank commander. And in those very classrooms, that's where he sat and learnt his skills on how to fight a tank. We're just going to go over to a tank. A lot of people get excited. It's a recce vehicle, a scimitar. And young Dom was in the Scots Dragoon Guards, and their recce troop would have been these scimitars. And once we'd done our classroom activity, we then went out in Salisbury Plain, which is thousands of square kilometres that way, charging around in scimitars and chieftain tanks in those days, maybe Challenger ones. But yeah, this is exactly where your partner in crime and I learnt our trade many years ago.
Just inside the entrance to the main building, there's a memorial to those who died on training exercises, a wreath of poppies resting beside it. Mounted on the wall are stark reminders of the war in Ukraine, a Russian man-portable air defence system and a Ukrainian FPV drone, both recovered from the war zone. It's here that we meet Colonel James Thurston, Assistant Head of Lessons at the Army's Lessons Exploitation Centre.
So this is the headquarters of the Land Warfare Centre, where the director of Land Warfare, which is the two-star Major General, he's responsible for making sure the British Army is effectively trained to be able to do the job that it's required to do. This is where that's all sort of orchestrated from. In here you've got a few things. There's a small memorial there in memory of those who have died in training, reminding ourselves the importance of protecting our licence to operate, being ruthlessly effective in our planning of training to make sure we deliver the training as safe as we possibly can, but while making it as realistic and as demanding as we possibly can. It requires constant effort and attention. That's really, really important and fundamental, and in many ways the most important challenge to what we do. And then the outgoing General, Major General Chris Barry, presented this small presentation, and it's a Russian SA-7 and then an FPV drone. And the point that he would make was this reflection of the constants and accelerants of warfare. And what we try to do here in the Land Warfare Centre is deal with both those things which are the constants of warfare and things which are familiar, and also things that are unfamiliar, and particularly then focus in our warfare development of how we fight and how we train for that fight in terms of our training and our doctrine and things like that. So that's a really neat reminder as you come in that we've got to attend to both being good at the constants and being good at the accelerants.
We take our seats in a small classroom to talk through the war's key takeaways, with Colonel Thurston careful, understandably, about how much he shares. But before we get into what's changed, Hamish starts by asking a simpler question. Which lessons from the long history of warfare still hold true today?
A really fundamental question I'd be very keen to get James's view on. The principles of war, James, have fundamentally not changed. The way we fight might, but the principles of war, the maintenance of the aim, concentration of force, deception, all that sort of thing. Yeah. Now, I hope you're going to tell me that absolutely stands as true today in Ukraine as it has throughout our careers and beyond.
I'm absolutely going to agree with that. And part of the reasons that the writings of people like Sun Tzu and Clausewitz are as true today as they were then is because they echo and they play to the nature of warfare, which is enduring. And the way we try to think about it is seeing those things which are constants in warfare. So combat is really violent and visceral. Logistics is absolutely vital. Your ability to sustain yourself while fighting is absolutely critical. The ability to combine your arms, I've talked a bit about integration, that will win the day. And then train hard and fight easy is a quite well-known phrase that the British Army always used to talk about, and we still do. And that's really important. You can look back through history. Armies that train hard do well. And armies exist to do two things in my book. They exist to fight wars and they exist to train to be ready to fight wars. What then is the accelerants is how technology changes that character of conflict. It was Professor Sir Michael Howard, I think, and I'm paraphrasing him probably terribly here, but it's a bit of a fool's errand to try and predict the future. But the key is to be close enough to what it looks like when you get there to be able to adapt when you're there.
You are prioritising training the next generation, as it were, in facing the future threats, not only that this country faces, but of course NATO faces. And I suppose, very simply, what do you think the nature of that threat is at the present moment?
Yeah, so, the war in Ukraine offers us a unique opportunity because Ukraine is fighting Russia. And from NATO's perspective, we need to be prepared for that. So we spend a huge amount of time focusing on how Russia is fighting in Ukraine and how their operations are evolving from whatever sources we can find out, and try and sort of work out the so what's for the British Army and for particularly our role and our requirements under the NATO force model and what NATO is expecting us to deliver. In terms of my part in that plan, or my team's part in that plan, for us it's about actually trying to work out what really counts in terms of the things we could get on with and do now to make ourselves better, to optimize the force. And the way we've approached that in the Lessons Exploitation Centre is to try and summarize in a way that could be helpful to any level of command or soldier, from the most junior soldier right up to the most senior general. What I find I'm often asked as the head of the Lessons Centre is, what are we learning about?
It's going to be my next question.
The war in Ukraine. And when asked that question, what I will usually try and do is generally push it back to the question asker and say, it depends on who we is. Because what is important to the Chief of the General Staff will be very different to what is important to a young Lance Corporal in an infantry fire team, and everywhere in between. So a staff officer trying to deliver an important armoured vehicle programme will have a different perspective of what's important to a chef who's going to be required to sustain a regiment in the field for whatever. Do you see what I mean? So the answer to the question massively depends on the context in which you ask it. And I think that point about context is also something that's really important, because it's very easy to be drawn into studying solely how Ukraine fights and how Russia fights, and doing a whole load of analysis on that. Now, that is really important, and it's an important part of some of the thinking that's going on. But equally, the context in which NATO will fight, if it finds itself fighting, will be a slightly different context to that in which Ukraine is fighting. And trying to understand the implications of the context are really important. And so what we've tried to do is to come up with some sort of useful thinking and insights. And I use the word insights very deliberately, because you can't say you've learned a lesson until you've actually done something specific about it. You can identify a lesson, think this is what needs to be done, but it's until you've actually driven change properly through an organisation and baked it into your doctrine, that's an important thing to be able to do.
Well, you talked about the lessons for a lance corporal and for a general. Are there any that you are able to give examples of that would apply to both of those?
Yes, I think so. And one of the documents we've published recently to the team is something called Countering the Threat, the Top 12. Well, we've taken what we think are the 12 most important themes, basically, that come to us as we reflect on the fight we see that's going on at the moment. And although this is on the radio, you can't see it, but we've got a rather natty picture of a Swiss Army penknife, because that highlights a sort of multi-tool, and it just felt like a good way to try and capture it, to make it easier for people to try and remember. But those themes, firstly, know your enemy, understanding exactly who and what it is you'll be coming up against. I think what's interesting is clearly, one might predict that Russian commanders and formations that are fighting in Ukraine, if in some future scenario, that experience will be transferred in the Russian psyche and the Russian way of fighting. So we should really understand how they're doing it, because they'll be doing the same as us. They'll be likely to apply those lessons. Fighting by recce strike is the way that the army is really trying to work out how to punch at range and evolve. This point about treating survival as a deliberate operation, what has become really apparent as you look to Ukraine, and I'll come on to drones in the middle, and uncrewed systems, is the...
It's very interesting that drones is on here. This would have been inconceivable just a handful of years ago.
Well, yeah, it's fascinating. And I think this is one of the greatest challenges that I would observe all armies are kind of wrestling with at the moment. And Ukraine, their skills with drone and drone operators are phenomenal. And I think, that what's sometimes known as the near surface, that area is an area of really interesting challenge. I reflect back a bit to, in the sort of late 70s, I think it was, early 80s, the US in particular were trying to work out what the air-land battle looked like and how to do combined arms integration, bringing the air in. And what I think some of the uncrewed systems in the near surface have opened up, and they've made it just that bit more complicated, that bit more lethal. There's much greater opportunity to do much more effective killing of your enemy, which is ultimately what it's about. But it's not just about your ability to, what we would say, to prosecute kinetically. It's also your ability to understand, to see, whether that's visually seeing or electromagnetically seeing, to jam. So there's a whole load. It's much more complicated. The late, great Field Marshal Viscount Slim used to talk about the orchestration of war. And he used the phrase orchestration deliberately, because when an orchestra plays really well, everything comes together in tune, and it's synchronized and it's harmonized. If you get a brilliant violin player and a brilliant bass drum player and a brilliant brass, you get my point. But if they don't play together as a team really well, it sounds dreadful. And this is this point about orchestration. So the role of the conductor in bringing it together is really important. I think what technology is opening up now is an additional piece here. And the only analogy I can think of that brings it to life is you take your orchestra, but now go and think like a ballet or something. And you've got dancers on there as well, which is another slightly different thing. But again, if they're out of time with everything else, it just doesn't work. So that's a slightly sort of classical analogy. And it came to me actually when I reflect back on my time spent in Kyiv actually as the orbital commander before the war, where I remember having a discussion with some senior Ukrainian officers. I was trying to describe combined arms maneuver, and my Ukrainian wasn't particularly strong. I used Slim's discussion about orchestration. And although drones were only still in their relatively early days then, it was quite a useful analogy to try and make a point through a language barrier.
So we jumped ahead to countering enemy drones and master the drone war, but there's one that we've not covered, so expect enemy attack everywhere from the outset. How does that differ from perhaps advice that was being given a few years ago?
Yeah, so this sort of plays to the point about hybrid war. We need to be absolutely ready. Sometimes you've heard the United States sometimes talk about fighting from factory to foxhole. And it's really important you look at the totality of what the army is required to do and those early phases, and just being really, really mindful about that. I mean, you've seen across Europe now the incursions of drones. So, we need to get ourselves in a place to prepare for that sort of stuff now, to my mind. And we're absolutely starting to get people thinking about that and understanding that, both at home and in training as much as on operations.
The one that really stands out to me is the recce strike you're talking about there. And to me, as an old soldier, that seems absolutely essential. And I suppose my question is, it's about acquiring the targets and then being able to prosecute those targets. And also something that we found so very difficult in Iraq and Afghanistan, all the battle damage assessment and actually hitting the right target. So can you just unpack that sort of recce strike and what it sort of means?
The mindset is about find the enemy early, hunt them down early and hit them at range. So you can damage them as far out as you can. So by the time you get to them or they get to you, depending on the nature of the operation, you have ripped them apart as much as you possibly can. So it's that thought to punch at range and to try not to get into the close fight until you absolutely have to. If I was trying to put it in really, really simple terms. And arguably that's always been the case. I mean, I think back to some of the older doctrine we used to talk about find, fix, strike and exploit. And it's in many ways it's very similar. But what technology is opening up is the ability to do that to an incredibly effective way.
Could you sort of give an example? What are the guys and girls learning at the back on Salisbury Plain at maybe platoon level? What would that mean? And how are they training to be able to affect that?
So I won't go into too much specifics,
Sure.
But for example, let's take this into the, what drones bring to the team sheet. So learning to fly drones and learning to understand how to use them, those sort of small uncrewed aerial systems, those small UAS, because what that can then offer is your ability to see and prepare yourself further and potentially also to prosecute. If you could identify a target long before you have to get your people engaged in the close fight and then do something about it, why wouldn't you do that? Yeah. And then equally, you have to flip it on its head and work out how to defend against that, because your adversary will be doing that just as much. So you've got to work out how to protect what are your vital assets, the vital parts of that organisation and that system of fighting.
Move on a transparent battlefield. What do we mean by transparent?
What we're seeing from so much of the open source reporting and stuff like that, and you've seen just how much, whether it's electromagnetically or in the visual spectrum, what the near surface has opened up is it's much harder to hide. And therefore, you can take a number of different approaches, whether you think about, camouflage and the role of, therefore, deception is really important, the role of your ability to hide yourself, or equally just as much these days to get underground. We've learned a lot of lessons recently, remembering just the importance of getting good at digging trenches. There's a whole generation of us, as having fought counterinsurgencies, that stuff had got a bit dusty on a shelf. Yeah. That skill set had got a bit of, it's not we didn't ever know it, and Hamish would definitely remember that sort of thing, but we just didn't do as much of it as we should do. And as the boys and girls on Interflex found, that was really important part of the Ukrainians' training and preparation.
Has there been a big shift in how one builds trenches today? Has technology enabled any change, or is it basically the same as during the First World War?
Well, yeah, there's some quite well-known pictures of the First World War and pictures of the trenches today in Ukraine, and a lot of them look really similar. And some of that is just based on simple physics and stuff like that. Of course, there's some sort of minor changes and adjustments you can make, I think. I probably won't go into too much specifics. I think what has changed is the way drones can exploit trenches. Overhead protection has evolved a bit. Some of the things going on in terms of ways to protect that, we're having to really be innovative. And I'll probably leave it at that. But I mean, you'll see in some of the open source reporting things like use of netting and stuff like that. You know, camouflage netting would have been used before in previous wars, but sort of using netting in a way to try and interdict drones that are flying perhaps with fiber optic cable control and stuff like that. So there's evolutions, and that's some of that, you know, slightly changing character stuff.
Fight in the electromagnetic spectrum. What do we mean when we're talking about that?
Well, Russia's very, very good at electronic warfare, and we absolutely have to be better than them at it. And it's difficult and demanding, and so much of the way the modern battlefield works is all about the electronics that, you know, that underpin it.
That's very interesting, because sorry to interrupt, but that's not something that's very often talked about. So perhaps you can unpack that a little bit more. In what ways is this being a decisive aspect in this war in Ukraine at the moment?
Well, so I think it's about the way, and again, I'll be slightly vague, but the information that helps you make decisions fast is really important to get the right information to the right place. At the
and
right
if that's
time.
disrupted, that causes very serious problems.
Yeah, and so CGS, for example, and it's sort of how you enable this recce strike concept. The Chief of the General Staff has talked about, you know, any sensor, any decider, any effector. So see something early, make the right decision at the right place with the right information as fast as you can, and then do something about it, i.e. punch in whatever way, shape or form you want that punch to take. And doing that fast gets you inside the old OODA loop, you know, the observe, orientate, decide, act. So how you outpace your opponent in sort of tempo terms. And your ability to be the best in the electromagnetic spectrum is absolutely fundamental to underpinning that. And likewise, if you can disable that, for want of a better word, in your adversary, you will get an advantage over them. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. Survive and operate in the CBRN environment.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really clear, and again, it's really apparent that, and Hamish is smiling because I know this.
This is very much Hamish's. Well, Hamish, perhaps first of all, you can just tell everybody what is CBRN.
In this particular aspect, it stands for chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear. What we're talking here is really chemical warfare, and James will go into it. But, you know, certainly something I've been commentating a lot, the industrial use of chemical weapons on the front line. I mean, really, really effective. And the Ukrainians have detailed 12,000 uses in the last 18 months, which is huge, but it's having the same impact, or it did initially, than the first use of chemical weapons at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, in that troops on the ground didn't have protection. The Russians are chucking a lot of chloropecrin into it, and it's having an impact as though it was a real chemical weapon, and it's how people react to it. And I think, you know, that is a threat. Reading it and speaking to the Ukrainians I know, I think they're now getting on top of that, but an awful lot of that solutioneering has actually come by James and his teams and the trainers at Interflex.
So are we on top of it, James?
Yeah, and I won't talk exact numbers, but just been involved in our sort of end-of-year wash-ups about what sort of the training's looking like, and the amount of CBRN training we're doing is significantly up. And certainly if I cast my mind back to when I was a commanding officer or when I was a company commander, and, you know, at that time our focus was very different. And it goes back to point one, know your enemy. That wasn't necessarily the primary threat at the time. But as Hamish has just said, the Russians are using chemical weapons out there from what the Ukrainians are telling us. Know your enemy, we should absolutely expect. And it's difficult and hard to fight in a chemical environment, and you have to practice. It goes back to that point about train hard, fight easy. So we've got to practice it more, and we are practicing it. We used to interview all the Ukrainian soldiers as they came through, and it gave us a unique insight into understanding their experiences from which they were coming to us, which were many and varied, but often gave us some really important insights into, for example, the amount of times that the Russians had been employing chemical weapons,
war crimes
in the fight. So we're able to gather and collect that data, pass that back up, and that's really important for whatever may happen in the future. But also in terms of implications for our own training, we should expect that to be used against us if we find ourselves going to war in that context. So just really useful to be able to understand the realities. And as we prepared some of the documents we're going to talk about in terms of countering the threat and things like that, that evidence base from those who are fighting those who we see as our greatest threat is really important.
On the CBRN side, a lot of talk is how we're simulating this sort of training. I have a family interest in Sandhurst at the moment, and I gather the training there is incredible, and drones all over the place, and they're doing a hell of a lot of digging. But can you replicate chemical attacks that have been seen in the front line at the moment?
Yeah, so we're absolutely trying to work out the best ways of doing those sort of things in a suitably safe for training way that also drives in some of the jeopardy and pressure, and understanding where if you got something wrong, you would have become a casualty yourself. And in terms of the method of delivery of some of these things, drones and droppers is something that we've seen out on the front, as well as obviously, artillery missions. So trying to replicate in training the effects of that. I know on Op Interflex, they've been using balloon droppers, and they've been working really hard to develop training, and we've absolutely learnt from that. And the Army is working really hard with people like the Military Aviation Authority to ensure we can train safely to do such replications. That sometimes we talk about teaching the Army to look up in a way that we perhaps didn't do in the same way when we were fighting counterinsurgencies. So if you're getting it wrong, someone's going to drop something on you, whether it's a water balloon with paint powder and stuff like that. So that's simulation, clearly, and starting to do that and really work out how to continue to increase that effectiveness of training for that sort of near surface environment.
You say look up, and just as a side tangent question, of course, air defence has been something that's become increasingly important in this war. When you look at the implications for the British Army, what do you take away from the war in Ukraine on that subject?
Well, it's clearly really, really important, and we know that, and we have always known that. And what we really need to do is make sure that our muscle memory, our understanding of the system approach to integrated air and missile defence, and then as it plays right back down to what that looks like at the sort of tactical level for the lowest soldier, people understanding their part in the plan, understanding what the different threats are, and that comes from practice, training and understanding. And you can do quite a lot of that in the simulators as much as you can in the field as well.
Now, when it comes to risks, I'm not just talking about CBRN risk, is that something we're learning from the war, that actually that we must have an appetite for risk greater than we perhaps have in the past in order to be successful on this battlefield?
I think a better word than risk is jeopardy. Yeah. You've got to develop jeopardy in training, and it links to battlefield inoculation. I remember what was really clear to me, certainly as the Interflex commander, the amount of emphasis the Ukrainians wanted us to put on making the battlefield inoculation for new soldiers as realistic as possible. Now, in training, that is risky and demanding. So you've got to use innovative and simulation ways and other ways as best you can to, from a training perspective, to safely create the jeopardy that the real-time risk, so you aren't overwhelmed by it when you get to the battlefield. And that's really difficult. And it takes a lot of thought. What I would say is, all the policies we have in place for training safely, if you rigorously apply them and plan properly and carefully approach your planning of dangerous activities, you can make them to a tolerable level of safety, which is absolutely important. And if you get it right, you can generate jeopardy to put commanders and soldiers at all levels under the required pressure to practice that.
You were talking about inoculation in a sort of metaphorical sense, but the next one, number 10, treat the wounded under fire. This is something we have talked a lot about on the podcast quite recently in relation to the war in Ukraine, the horrific injuries that the wounded are suffering, and indeed the terrible cases of wounded soldiers being stuck in no man's land and having to be brought back by robots. I mean, what kind of ways are you thinking differently on this subject now?
Well, it goes back to the point about constants and accelerants. And if I reflect on, the operations I was part of in Iraq and Afghanistan, you had a medical setup and a casualty evacuation chain that was supporting operations behind you that was incredibly well resourced, very fast, very rapid. And I think the reality of what we're seeing when you go warfight, we've forgotten the scale of warfighting means it's just impossible to be able to replicate some of those really, really good casualty evacuation systems to the same level. And what it means is you need to ask your medics to be able to do more. Every soldier needs to be able to have a greater level of skill training. So we've changed the type of basic medical training we're doing across the army to reflect some of that. Today's stories are telling us it's likely to be longer than perhaps it was what we had got used to for the last 30 years. But if you go back to big war fighting in history, it's sort of reminding ourselves things that would have been familiar to our grandparents, I would say.
As you say, dusting things off the shelf. Sorry, Hamish.
And just picking it up on that, I think, what we used to in Iraq and Afghanistan, that sort of golden hour and having the MERT or whatever it is flying in to get you out. You can now see that just won't work on the battlefield.
There was one instance of a soldier we were reporting on recently who was in the field for well over a week, and I've heard cases of multiple weeks in certain cases. This is a totally different battlefield, isn't it?
And that demands of all our people an inner resilience and toughness to be not frightened by that. Warfare will be frightening, but to be tough enough and resilient enough and strong enough to be able to deal with that. And something that has always impressed me with the Ukrainians from both before the war and those I've met since in Interflex and stuff like that, is that inner resilience and toughness is so humbling to witness firsthand. So one of the lessons we're learning from particularly our experience of working with Ukrainians and understanding the importance and the challenges of medical care, treating the wounded under fire, and what individual soldiers should be able to do concurrently. Interflex adopted TCCC from I think it was our Canadian colleagues on the mission initially who were talking about it to us, Tactical Care of the Combat Casualty, which is a sort of program. We had the BCD approach in the British Army, Battlefield Combat Drills. But what we've done now in the Army is with the Defence Medical Services clinicians, we've evolved our own medical training at the lowest levels to sort of bring in appropriately some of those additional lessons. So we absolutely take lessons from what we're seeing and keep up to date, evolving our doctrine, evolving our training. And that's very much what we're a part of here in the Land Warfare Centre, making sure the right people, the right practitioners are getting access to the lessons being learned so they can make the right and appropriate changes into doctrine, changes into training.
So a doctrine,
to keep us fit for the fight.
A doctrine that was had by the Canadians and was applied to certain British soldiers, trained to the Ukrainians, and now being trained on British soldiers. It speaks a lot.
Yeah, also we've evolved our approach to do what we believe is best and make it our own now.
So our final two, conduct mobility and counter mobility.
So, that's about your ability to effectively prosecute manoeuvre around a battlefield and indeed to stop your adversary from manoeuvring. And, that's on a transparent battlefield and with the amount of fires that can bring to bear, that can be really, really complicated. The other thing this sort of talks to is things like minefields and dealing with mines. And, what we have seen is huge amounts of minefields being laid to a level that even our own doctrine, we've gone, wow, I think we need to expect more. And your ability to be able to sort of deal with that, because of course, minefields are put there to shape your maneuver. So you've got to be able to deal with them to either open them up or take them into account.
And just picking up on that, James, I think people have become very used to this being a static war, the contact line, and perhaps lots of criticism that we haven't seen combined arms manoeuvre. Perhaps the Russians can't do it to any great degree because they can't train their conscripts. And when I was doing combined arms training as CO of a tank regiment, it was a year's training. But if we were fighting in this environment, we being the UK and NATO, presumably the whole combined arms manoeuvre, the mobility, counter mobility you're talking about, we would hope to operate more in a combined arms manoeuvre fashion than this sort of static warfare that we're seeing at the moment. I think a lot of people saying, why are we having tanks, blah, and all the rest of it? Because I think that we would probably fight slightly differently because we can train.
And that's something you were saying at the very top, Colonel.
Exactly, Francis. Yeah, it takes it right back to that point about context is really, really important. And, if there's something that keeps me awake at night, it's probably that what if we're learning the wrong lessons? And the context of the fight we see in Ukraine, exactly like you described, has become a very sort of static fight, isn't necessarily what NATO would expect us to be able to bring to the table, that skill set to be able to bring to the table. So we've got to train to be able to do what NATO is expecting and ask us to do. And trying to work out what that's going to look like, particularly with these accelerants and how they're playing out, is really challenging. It's that complicated orchestration that technology has opened up with the advent of drones, uncrewed systems, the opportunities and risks it throws.
NATO integration, how is that going? I mean, this feels like a very vulnerable time for the alliance in some ways. Do you feel that the alliance itself can be relied upon, particularly one partner in particular is a very important member of that?
Well, I mean, so from my perspective, I'm absolutely focused on making sure what we're doing to get our part in the plan as strong as it can be. But we talk to our NATO partners all the time. My experience of Interflex showed that, you know, those NATO members who were on there with us were really tight. My level, I don't see any evidence of that sort of weakness playing out that you purport, because we use NATO doctrine, we put NATO first. And in terms of the thinking about the application of this, we're always thinking of it in a NATO mindset. And I know that's certainly how our commanders are thinking.
Just to follow up on that, on a purely practical level, those kind of NATO lessons, NATO integration, how does that work? I mean, do you pick up the phone to the French and say, we're training this at the moment, we need to make sure that you're using the same?
Yeah, it's nested in the common doctrine of NATO doctrine and NATO warfighting. And then you have standards you have to achieve through evaluation. You'll probably remember Stan-Evals and Stan-Ags and things like that.
Hamish is shaking his head. Traumatic memories, I think.
Sort of book you never open.
So it's understanding how not only you will fight, but how your partners and your allies will fight. And having common procedures, common practices is a really important part of that. The other thing I'd say is, of course, there's lots of the British Army across lots of parts of Europe in Operation Cabrit and things like that, for example, where we're absolutely working, training, operating alongside our NATO partners. So we, as the lessons guy, I spend as much time, you know, looking at those operations and working out what's working, where we can do better and all that. It goes back to that point about context.
So, last but not least, face the reality of war. So, Colonel, what is the reality of war now?
Well, I mean, probably ask my late grandparents, but history is really important. It's remembering some of those things. And I think we need to think not simply just about how we train for the fight as an army, but just thinking slightly bigger as well, and just doing what we can to be prepared for that. And, you know, I have a small team of historians who work in our Lessons Exploitation Centre, and a lot of what they do is really important. They'll take the contemporary challenges and they'll dig out a historical anecdote that reminds us of this, and absolutely plays,
what a dream job.
Absolutely plays to it's a great job and they're brilliant, but absolutely plays to that bit about the constants, because there's generally not much that hasn't been seen or heard of before in some way, shape or form, and it's just about applying and then sort of reminding that. And, you know, one of the things I would say about looking at the current threat picture across Europe, that is not unfamiliar geography, where much blood has been spilt in the last 150 years fighting over it. So, you know, you can already learn from the historical application of when armies fought.
Do you really think that we are in the most dangerous times that we've seen for decades, and that we might well be very much facing the prospect of something far more serious down the road?
If I was to answer that personally, I suppose I think about it in a number of ways. I think about it as a professional soldier, and in that, I am really clear in my mind that there is a very clear threat, and it's my job to be as professional as I can. Noting I'm getting into my early 50s now, knowing my part in the plan, what I can do, and using my brain and my experience to help prepare the force and be ready to be part of it. So there's that. I also look at it as a father, and I've got teenage children, and, you know, having spent a year training Ukrainians, I was always really humbled by the fact that it felt like I was training more fathers than I was training sons sometimes, if that makes sense.
Yes, because of the ages.
The sacrifice that the Ukrainian adult generation is making to protect some of its younger people. And I think that's really, really humbling, but it's also a great reminder of some of the very human aspects of warfighting. And we should absolutely think about some of those things too. And then I think there's the challenges that every nation will face about the industrial scale of warfare, whether that's from the requirements for mobilising armies. The first armies don't usually win wars in history. It's the second and third armies that come behind.
And quite often the citizen armies.
Yeah, absolutely. And, what I would say is that the training system we've built now in the British Army, the land training system, is a system that can absolutely help to be able to deliver downstream that sort of scale of training should that need be asked for. And our experience from Op Interflex, what we've learned about training large numbers of people and training them fast and quickly, along with, some of the historical documents and the sort of historical memories of how we were doing it ourselves as the British back in the Second World War days and stuff. There's a lot of lessons we can take away there to think about that. And what I would say is, as we start to think about all sorts of contingencies, of course, we take all that sort of information into, and it goes back to being a professional lessons learning organisation. If you look up on some of the hillsides around here, you can see regimental cap badges of Australians, Americans, and all those who were here preparing for the Normandy landings for a long time, and they're training. And they did a huge amount of training here to get themselves ready for war. So I suppose that I reflect on the importance of alliances, and we saw that here. I reflect on the importance of training for war. I reflect also on things like, deception. There was some incredible deception operations that wrapped into the sort of run up to Overlord and stuff like that. It's all stuff that can be done if you apply it carefully. And perhaps it's a nice, neat finish, actually, because it takes us to, we're here in the Land Warfare Centre. Our motto is Bello te prepares, which means prepare yourself for war. I think it's a quote from, I think it was Vegetius, who was Roman warrior.
He who wants peace, prepare for war.
Well, and exactly, and it's in fact, you can see it on on the mug there.
There it is.
But it's an extract from the longer piece, which is, if you want peace, prepare for war. And it goes back to that point about faith reality. You've got to have the mindset to be ready to fight, and then hopefully, God willing, that will create the conditions where your deterrence credibility is so much that your adversary will think, do you know what, I'm going to take them on today, and I might kick that can downstream.
Final question. Yeah. What would your message be to the enemies of NATO?
My message to the enemies? So I would say that the British Army's got a great history, and we will be as strong in the future as we were in the past.
My thanks to Hamish for helping to facilitate this interview, and of course to Colonel Thurston, to the Land Warfare Centre, and to the Ministry of Defence. If you're interested in learning more, you'll find a link in the show notes. That's all from me for now.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.